There we go. All right, well, welcome everybody. This is an hour-long session. I intend for our presentation to take maybe 40 or 45 minutes, so there's time at the end to answer your questions. You're welcome to add questions in the chat. I won't be able to actively monitor those questions as I'm giving the presentation, but I will go back to the chat after the presentation is over and address any questions that you've posted. So in disclosure, before we get started, first off, this meeting is being recorded, so it will be available at a later date if you'd like to review it. This is an informational session only. So it is presented by myself, Maria Stewart, and sponsored by NOFA New Jersey. Neither myself nor NOFA New Jersey are affiliated with the USDA. The session is an educational outreach activity sponsored by NOFA to support local food and farming in New Jersey. If you do have specific questions about this grant opportunity after the presentation, I encourage you to reach out directly to the USDA Rural Development Office, and their contact information will be provided at the end of this session. All right, so our agenda today, I'll give a brief introduction of myself. Then we'll talk about what the term value added actually means, since it's really key to understanding what this grant opportunity can support. We'll discuss the two different types of projects that can be funded with the USDA Value-Added Producer Grant, a planning grant or a working capital grant. And then we'll deep dive into the actual components of this grant opportunity, discussing eligibility criteria, which includes eligibility criteria of the applicant, of a type of project and expenses that are eligible to be a part of your proposal, and then talk about some of the key application components and wrap up with deadlines and resources. We'll finish out our hour together with some question and answer time. So just a little background on myself. So like I said, I'm Maria Stewart. I'm owner and founder of a consulting firm called Growing Brilliance, and I'm working with NOFA to support grant writing for farmers in the next few months. You may have seen me at the NOFA New Jersey conference, the winter conference that was just a couple of weeks ago, and we have more activities on the way for supporting grant writing efforts. I got into this role because I had a couple of different professional experiences that all came together and sort of was, an intersectional point where I said, aha, this is a way I can support our local agriculture community. So I spent around 10 years in academia chasing grant money as a researcher at a university. And my research lab for 7.5 of those years was really funded by extramural grants, money coming from outside agencies. So I had a lot of experience writing grant proposals. I went to formal grant writer training sponsored by the National Institutes of Health, and had a lot of experience on the academic side of grant writing. As I moved into our farming business, which is called Gorgeous Goat Creamery, we're a small goat dairy located in Hunterdon County, I recognized that my skills for grant writing could actually benefit our farm. And that was a really great combination of having that grant writing experience and a new developing dairy farm where we wanted to get some extra support from different agencies to fund our activities. So we have received 2 value-added producer grants as a goat farm. So I can speak from experience in an actual applicant that, we are doing the project right now at our farm. And also I have written grant proposals for VAPG applicants for other clients, so farm businesses that are not my own. So it gives a diversity of the experiences there. And as a result of that intersectionality, Growing Brilliance was developed as a consulting firm that I lead to provide services for farmers, especially in the grant writing space. So that's just a little background. We're going to get into this grant opportunity, which just opened up a couple weeks ago. The USDA, the United States Department of Agriculture, has been supporting value-added products for a number of years. And this is with the annual Value-Added Producer Grant opportunity. When you hear the term value added, it's 2 very straightforward words, value and added. And when we think of it in the agricultural context, we are essentially taking a raw agricultural commodity, so it could be grain, livestock, fresh fruits or vegetables in their raw state, and changing that physical state such that we have now increased the value of that finished good. And this particular grant opportunity is focused on 3 different aspects of value added. That change in physical state is the very obvious one, where we might be going from fresh fruit to a juice, or fresh vegetables to salsa, or maybe we're dehydrating and drying to make a fruit trail mix, or something of that nature, or milling flour. There's also an aspect of value added for this grant opportunity that is addressing the differentiated production or marketing of a product. And that's something that has to be supported with a business plan. So it might be, differentiating what you make based on the locality that you are, producing from. So maybe it's a sensitive watershed that you're really wanting to promote your agricultural practices and the finished good from that angle. So you're taking a very unique marketing approach with that. It can also be something more basic, like using, the organic certification to promote your products if you're a certified organic producer. And then lastly, in our value added discussion, there is an opportunity for a project to be addressing product segregation. And this is easier to think about in more of a commodity crop context, but this would be like an identity preserved marketing system. So as we know with corn that's grown nationwide, some corn is GMO corn, other corn is not GMO. And so when we want to have an identity preserved program, that would ensure that the corn that you're harvesting and selling has traceability within that supply chain such that it can be verified as non-GMO corn. And so that's really what is capturing that third aspect. So any 3 of these components could be, a project theme as you're looking towards putting together a value-added producer grant application. And I think the first one, that's change in physical state, is the one that we see most frequently with producers thinking about, how do I manage extra crops, especially when we're in a season where everybody has extra tomatoes or everybody has extra apples, or maybe we're contending with an early frost and you want to have a backup plan to be able to process extra produce that's harvested, which is harvested in a very urgent manner. So that's an overview of the concept of value added. We'll get into the 2 different types of the value-added producer projects. So this value-added producer grant is, focusing on bringing that raw agricultural commodity into a differentiated state. And this could be a pretty significant undertaking. One of the things that the USDA VAPG grant can support is the planning for actually the implementation of your value-added products. That's what the planning grant refers to on the left side of the screen. A planning grant is intended to provide you that runway for assessing whether or not this endeavor is something you really want to commit to. So a planning grant is a little bit smaller grant opportunity where the award cap from the USDA is $75,000. And you can see in that box on the left, there are certain types of activities that a planning grant can support. Most of these are activities that are intended to identify the economic viability of your value-added venture. So these are going to be feasibility studies, marketing plans, or even your business plan development that includes your value-added venture. And these types of reports need to be developed by a third party. So even though you might have an existing business plan, the planning grant opportunity would then provide you with the funds to hire an appropriate qualified third party to help you, build out that business plan further to include the economic and technical assessment of your ability to add this value-added product line into your portfolio. A feasibility study is going to be focused solely on the ability of you as a producer to embark on this value-added project. It will assess you as an entity, a business entity, and your capabilities of having enough raw material in order to make that value-added product, your technical expertise in the field. Perhaps you don't have all the technical expertise necessary to go into the value-added space, but you have other qualified individuals who will be on your project team as consultants. A feasibility study would address that need to bring in a qualified consultant for perhaps processing considerations if you're making a finished good that's shelf stable. So the feasibility study is a component that will be focused specifically on your value-added endeavor and, go through not only some of the practical applications of your value-added project, but they'll also look at the financial aspects. So the feasibility study will typically include, a projection up to 3 to 5 years in the future of how will your business react to adding this value-added venture as part of your financial model. And a lot of times starting a value-added project will require quite a bit of financial investment for the first year or two. But then after you have that startup established, you'll be able to realize the financial benefit. And in years 3, 4, maybe 5, you'll be able to see that there's a financial gain for your business, for your farm business, after you've incurred those initial startup costs. Essentially, that feasibility study will pressure test your idea and be able to provide that concrete, data-driven, consensus on whether or not this is a good idea. The feasibility study can then be used as supporting documents if you want to move forward and apply for a working capital grant. So the planning grant is smaller. It's typically a little bit shorter for most people because they don't need, a full 3 years to conduct a planning grant activities. And this can be then the precursor to applying for a working capital grant. One thing I didn't mention that's on the slide is that it can also be used to develop a marketing plan for your value-added endeavor. Because a lot of times if we're working within a fresh commodity, marketing and selling something that is shelf stable might require different approaches. Maybe you'll be looking more at wholesale opportunities or be looking at year-round sales where you might be selling only seasonally now. So that marketing plan could also be part of a planning grant, which will be very important for your success if you're going to go forward with that value-added project. So that's a planning grant, a little bit smaller, but oftentimes this is a good first step if you're interested in going the route of value-added products. The second type of grant within this program is the working capital grant. This is the one we hear about more frequently because this is an opportunity for the USDA to fund your actual work, your production for value-added products. You'll notice the award cap is much higher, and that's because the endeavor is a more significant endeavor. So the activities that a working capital grant can support are expenses that are related to processing and marketing your value-added products. So essentially making that finished good for a value-added product, and then the marketing that goes along with it in order for you to successfully sell that. If you are looking at the differentiated component for a value-added grant for perhaps marketing your products based on your regional locale or based on being organic certified, that is going to focus specifically on the marketing side of the allowable expenses, not so much the production side. But within the broader scope of production and marketing for a value-added product, you'll see that there are quite a few different types of expenses that are allowable. You can have the grant support sales staff that are selling this product that is being created through the project. You can also use the project to support processing facility time. So if you're going to a certified kitchen or a co-manufacturer and you are paying a fee to use that space for this production, the grant can support that. You'll obviously need to have packaging supplies for your new product, so the grant can support boxes, bags, jars, labels, whatever might be necessary for you to now package that value-added product. The marketing and advertising costs, this can range from website upgrades or development online store development, paid advertising. There's a very wide range that fits within the marketing and advertising costs that the grant can support. And then also the value of your own raw agricultural commodity can count towards these project expenses. And this is part of what we would call an in-kind contribution. I'll get to that in a couple slides. But that value of your raw commodity, it is very important for you to be successful in making the value-added product. If you don't have the raw starting commodity, then you're not going to be able to make the value-added product, right? And the USDA recognizes that raw commodity comes with a specific price associated with it, and that can be used as part of your matching for the project costs. So this lays out the two different types of projects. If you're just sort of thinking about a value-added producer grant, you may want to explore the planning grant. Planning grants can be very useful with that feasibility study development. And as you'll see in a few slides, feasibility studies are required for large working capital grants. So this might be a good kind of pipeline for you to get going on that. All right, we'll talk next about eligible applicants. So the Value-Added Producer Grant has very clear eligibility criteria. And essentially, you have to fit into one of four categories. So you would possibly be an independent producer. This means that you are the business entity that is producing and you own more than 50% of that agricultural commodity that's used in the project. So you may need to purchase other ingredients or other raw materials, raw commodities from other farms or suppliers, but your raw commodity that you're actively producing needs to be comprising at least 50% of what's going into your value-added product. This also includes eligible applicants as an agricultural producer group. So this would be a nonprofit organization of individual producers that are working collectively to, explore a value-added project. Similarly, a farmer and rancher cooperative is an incorporated entity, so not a nonprofit, but an actual business that is controlled and owned by independent producers. And then lastly is a majority controlled producer-based business venture. And those are typically, quite large organizations. So if you're looking at these applicant, criteria and you're, nodding your head saying, yep, that's me, that's a good sign. If you're looking at these, eligible applicant descriptions, you say, oh, that's really not us. Don't despair. There are other opportunities within USDA rural development that can support nonprofits that are not comprised of individual producers and other entities that are operating in the agricultural and especially in the rural community space. So that's a topic for a different webinar, but don't despair if you look at these eligibility criteria and say, that's not for me, because there are some other opportunities available that might fit your organization better. A couple of other eligibility matters. If you are so lucky to have already received a value-added producer grant, you cannot have two of them running at the same time. You have essentially 90 days for that prior project to close upon the time you submit your new application. Otherwise, your new application will not be considered for funding. So that's to try and, ensure fairness across all the applicants. And then lastly, individual applicants must be U.S. citizens or permanent residents. So now let's get into eligible projects and eligible expenses. So what can we actually, pay for as part of this grant? We talked a little bit about in the overview of the two different grant types, the planning grant and the working capital grant, but here we'll get into a few more details. So with the eligible projects, one of the hallmarks that's really important to understand is that this new value-added product needs to be addressing an emerging market. And so what the USDA is expecting is that you're not just going to be bringing this value-added product to the same customers that you've been selling your previous products to. That you're actually also expanding your reach with your business's products. So this could be developing a new geographic market. Maybe you're going to start selling in different counties or even in a different state. Maybe you're going to be adding different farmers markets, or maybe establishing an on-farm store. This could all be addressing that new or developing geographic market. Also looking at new and developing demographic markets. So this would be targeting different characteristics of your consumer and focusing the sales for specific demographic categories. Now, the USDA understands that you might not be doing all of this brand new. So the sort of the asterisk on this emerging market criteria is that you might be active in this market already, just kind of getting your feet wet, but you can't have been active for more than 2 years in that market space. So they'll give you the pass and say, maybe you've tried this and you said, this could be really huge if I have the support to build out what my business can offer. So that's the little asterisk there where it says cannot have supplied this market for more than 2 years prior to application. Another component of the working capital grants in particular are that these expenses must be directly tied to the processing or marketing, and I should say, and or marketing of the value-added product. This grant will not fund the purchase of equipment, capital expenses like renovating a space, vehicle purchase or leases. This grant opportunity will not support those big ticket items, but they will support the expenses that are incurred with processing and marketing. So this is very important to consider, that if you are wanting to embark on a value-added product endeavor that would require you to purchase $15,000 of new equipment, the grant will not be able to support that. So you would need to find alternative funding, or maybe you're able to flex your own business budget to sink your costs into cash acquisition of those equipment that will then enable the value-added production. This grant opportunity also requires a one-to-one match. So we'll talk about this in a little bit more detail, but when you look at your total project costs, USDA will pay $1 and they expect that you're also going to pay $1. That's actually a requirement towards your total project costs. And so this match is very important to take into consideration as you plan the scope of a project. If you've ever done any kind of budgeting, you may know that the budget costs of a project can get very high very quickly. And so this is important to keep in check as you recognize that you as a business will be responsible for paying half of the costs of the project while USDA is paying for the other half. So let's talk about this match for a second. If we have a project, let's say we're going to develop, produce, and sell salsa. We have made our budget and we identified that the total project cost will be $200,000 over the course of 2 years. Now, if we take that match into consideration, and it's that one-for-one dollar-to-dollar match, the USDA will support up to 50% of the project cost, which means your grant award could be $100,000 if the USDA deems all the expenses are eligible. That means you're on the hook for $100,000 of that project. So this is where you have to be thinking about the financial process for you to be able to have this match funding available. It could be through a line of credit. It could be through cash reserves. The income generated from the project cannot be counted as future funds available for the project. The USDA wants to know that you have access to that $100,000 yourself as a business at the time of application. That does make it a little bit harder, but there are lenders out there that can extend lines of credits to farm businesses, and they'll even write a letter of support that indicates you as a farm business have this line of credit available so the USDA can verify that you have the cash match. You don't have to match with 100% cash though. I mentioned the in-kind match when I talked about the value of your raw commodity. So as an agricultural producer, if you're growing the tomatoes and the onions and the peppers and the cilantro that are going into the salsa, the value of all those different crops can be counted as a contribution towards the total project. So you have to make sure you write your budget correctly to demonstrate that you're going to be using, so many hundreds of pounds of peppers and so many thousands of pounds of tomatoes and whatever it nets out to be over the course of your project time. But that value would then be allowed to be considered as part of that cash match for an in-kind, I'm sorry, that it'd be allowed as the match for in-kind contributions. So an in-kind contribution is something that essentially you as the applicant are donating to the project. So it could be the value of the raw commodity. It could also be the value of labor. So when you have staff from your farm business working on project activities, so perhaps they are, actually at the processing facility working with the certified kitchen staff to make the salsa and can the salsa. That time that your staff member is spending to make the value-added product is countable towards, this in-kind match. So there's some, details here with budgeting where you can be very thoughtful on how you write your budget and look at your in-kind contributions versus cash contributions for that match. USDA tends to like cash contributions better, but it's acknowledged that the raw material, the commodity value, is sometimes very significant in some of these projects. And so those, can be accounted for with your budget development. All right, so that's our budget example. I mentioned the feasibility study from a planning grant might be necessary if you're going to apply for working capital. And I want to address this in a little more detail. So you saw in an earlier slide, we have our planning grant, we have our working capital grant as two different types of grants we can apply for under VAPG. If we look specifically at the working capital grant, there's actually two different kind of subcategories here. One is considered a simplified application. And that's if your request to the USDA is less than $50,000. So your total project cost is going to be less than $100,000 because you're paying half of that project and USDA is contributing half. If you have a project that's that size from a financial perspective or smaller, there is no requirement for a feasibility study or a business plan. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't have one because those are actually really good ideas anyhow, but the USDA will not deny reviewing your application if you do not provide those supporting documents. So if you have a smaller project, it would be under $100,000 for total project costs where your award request from the USDA is $50,000. That would be categorized as a simplified application, and that's one of the boxes you can tick as you're putting your application together. If you're applying for more than $50,000 as the award, so your project total cost is going to be more than $100,000, then this will be a full application and you will be required to submit a feasibility study, a business plan, and or a marketing plan to support this endeavor. I mentioned it's really a good idea to have these documents, even if you're applying for a simplified application, because that will not only strengthen your application, but also give you peace of mind that you've done your due diligence. And if you're going to kind of embark on a risky endeavor, it has a high probability of success based on the feasibility study. So if you're leaning towards that full application because you have a larger scale project in mind, this is where a planning grant could be a really good first step in order to fund that feasibility study and get your business plan all polished and tidied up so it's ready to be supporting your working capital application that you might be submitting a year or two later. When you're thinking about that feasibility study, it does have to be conducted by a third party. And what the USDA says is they want it to be a qualified consultant. Typically, there's a handful of consultants in this area that conduct feasibility studies. If you're wondering whether or not that individual or that entity is a qualified consultant, you could talk to the USDA Rural Development Rep just to confirm before you sign a contract for that feasibility study. But I think it's important to know within the working capital project scope, the smaller projects do not require that feasibility study or business plan submission, although it's a good idea. And then the larger projects do require that. So that's something to really keep in mind. All right, we'll talk a little bit about our key application components And if you've written grant proposals or grant applications for other funding agencies, you might notice that some of these are pretty similar. Most grant applications are going to require some of the same content because essentially the award committee wants to understand, what are you trying to do? Why should we support you and your, interest in doing this? And how's it going to, affect the broader community, align with the funding agency's goals, et cetera. So the nice thing about Value-Added Producer Grant is there is an application toolkit. It's essentially a template that is, it is very long. So it's not, just short and sweet, but it provides every single, topic that needs to be addressed as part of your application submission. So that VAPG project template is a great, way to get started and look at what are the required components of your project narrative. It's going to include aspects like the rationale. Why would you be, going about this? What's your approach? Like, how are you actually going to, develop, produce, market, and sell your value-added product? What are the qualifications of the project team? So you as an applicant and your staff, as well as any third parties that may be participating. And there's a few other components there as well that I'm not, for the interest of time, won't get into all the details, but this project narrative specific to VAPG should be filled out using the toolkit, using the template that's available on the website. And down at the bottom of the screen, I do have the link. So I'll be sharing these slides after the presentation. All these links are live, so you can just click on the link and go directly to the VAPG website and see where you can download that toolkit. So highly recommended to use that and take a look at it if you're interested in submitting an application. Another component that's common across many different types of grants is listing out your activities with measurable outcomes. So in the Value-Added Producer Grant, your activities are actually going to be aligned with your budget in such a way that you'll have to, structure your budget to say these expenses align with activity 1 and these expenses align with activity 2. And that means that there's a financial linkage there, but there's also going to be, some deliverables and timeline associated with those activities. So your activities could include, developing the recipe for your salsa, if we use that example, doing your production runs for making the salsa, taking that salsa to your sales outlets, marketing it, how else are you going to let people know that now you have salsa available? And some of these activities are sequential and some of these are going to be running concurrently. So those are, aspects with these measurable outcomes that are going to be tracked. And if you do get an award, you will need to submit a report every 6 months. And essentially that's a report to the USDA that references these activities and outcomes. You'll have to tell the USDA, how have you been making progress? Are you following the timeline that you had put forward? If not, what's going on? What's getting in your way? Is it something that you'll be able to overcome? And if you're right on target, right on task, you'll be delivering statistics and data about, how many jars of salsa did you produce? How many, pounds of the raw commodity were you able to, be able to move into this value-added product line? What were your sales values? Are you realizing some sales from this product already? So these activities with measurable outcomes, they're the specific goals of the project. And essentially it becomes a roadmap for you as you embark on the project to ensure that you stay on track. And they're also time bound. And because you would be submitting a report every 6 months, this is, one of the time aspects that you'd be looking at for the past 6 months. How well did you do with achieving the goals you thought you could achieve when you put in the application? And then lastly, the itemized budget. This does have a specific template that's available on the USDA website. Again, the same link on the bottom. It's called the SF424A, in case you were wondering, for non-construction projects. It's kind of a bear of a template to use, but I like to, to start working with a budget in an Excel spreadsheet just for ease of use. All of the expenses that you're putting in your budget need to be justified and relating back to those activities with measurable outcomes. If you are getting services from a third party, if you know that you're going to need to order X number of glass jars for your salsa, it's a really good idea to get quotes to support the cost of those materials and services in your application. Not only does this provide you with the due diligence, so you know what the actual costs are, but it then provides the USDA with that understanding of, yes, it does actually cost this much for this type of service from a third party, or it does actually cost this much for you to obtain the jars you need for your salsa. So that justification with quotes is really important. And the itemized budget will include a budget narrative as part of the project narrative, where you can explain, what exactly you're buying, and perhaps if you need to justify why you've chosen a certain vendor or service provider, you can do so in that budget narrative. So these key application components, you might notice, are fairly similar across different grant applications. And so this is, one thing to keep in mind, that if you're putting together an application for value-added producers and you don't get funded, this information that you've already gathered could be repurposed and either submitted again the next year, especially if you could get some feedback from the USDA on why your project wasn't selected, or maybe there's another opportunity, maybe something more local that could still be able to fund your project goals. So as we look at this opportunity, it is due in April. April 11th is the electronic deadline for applications, and this is submitted to our local USDA Rural Development Office here in New Jersey, so in Trenton. The program contact is a person named Mary Ann Tancredi. I've added her email address here. If you have specific questions about the grant opportunity or process, I highly recommend that you speak with her. She is the one at our local office for USDA that manages all the incoming applications. Also, if you know that you're going to submit, it's a good idea to let her know. Although the Federal Register announcement suggests that you put your application through grants.gov, my experience in the past is that the New Jersey Rural Development Office would prefer to receive your documents by email. And so that's why it's best to contact Mary Ann in advance of your submission to confirm that she would like to receive all the documents by email still. There's another layer in terms of being able to submit your application, and that's registry through the System for Awards Management, or SAM. This is essentially a federal clearinghouse that enters your business information in a database and determines if you are eligible or not eligible to receive federal funding. This would be true for federal contractors as well as for grant or loan recipients. In this case, you would be submitting your business information so you could get a SAM account created, and then when the funding announcement comes back and you magically get that award, then you're already in the system to be able to receive your reimbursement checks. So SAM registration is just an administrative process. You'll need your EIN number, you'll need your date of formation for your business. So you do need to be a registered business or nonprofit within New Jersey to register for SAM. It sometimes can take a couple of weeks, because the government's going to be checking IRS records and other records to confirm that you're a legitimate entity. So don't wait to the last minute if you think you might apply for a USDA Value-Added Producer Grant. Start that SAM application now, and it's all done online. It's not a terrible process, but it's, it takes just a little bit of time, and you have to have all your business information ready to be able to input it into the computer. So there's links on this page to the different resources that are relevant, especially if you're interested in getting that SAM registration started. This has been a recurring grant opportunity for many years, since the early 2000s, actually. Right now, it is tied with the Farm Bill. So the latest appropriation was through the Farm Bill that was passed in 2018. If you're following anything that's going on with policy and legislation, you probably know that the 2023 Farm Bill is going to become the 2024 Farm Bill, since we have not seen progress with getting that authorized yet. I just mention that because there's maybe a little bit of uncertainty for what would be available future, but right now this funding opportunity is open, it's live. And one thing I should mention is in New Jersey, from 2020 to 2022, 12 different VAPG awards were granted to a total of $1.7 million. So we actually do pretty well as a state, getting some funds, given that, we're a fairly small state and fairly small on some of the agricultural sides. So this opportunity is open and live now. Whether it'll be open next year again, we never know for certain, but it has, now a several decade track record of being available and being very successful for supporting producers for extending their product lines. All right. So as we wrap up today's session, I wanted to point out that NOFA is sponsoring a grant writing workshop that starts next week. If you're looking at this value-added producer grant and saying, yeah, I think I kind of want to give this a try. Maybe you want to apply for a planning grant, or, a working capital grant is more, suits what you need. The grant writing workshop that will be held starting next Tuesday for 3 sequential Tuesdays over Zoom is a general grant writing workshop to help you learn the skills of writing a successful grant proposal. So this could be used for a value-added producer grant application. It could be used for a sustainable agriculture research and education application. It could be for a private foundation. We're not specifying what type of opportunity you would want to be writing for, but a lot of the basics of grant writing are going to be the same no matter what funding opportunity is of interest. So if you're interested in joining me at the workshop, I'm the host of the workshop for those 3 Tuesdays. You can register at growingbrilliance.net, and it is free, supported by NOFA, New Jersey. Thanks, NOFA. So these are resources that will be available in the slides I send out after our session. All have live links. The general value-added producer grant page is here. There's a couple of links here. This is the application evaluation criteria. It is in the Code of Federal Regulations, so it's a very dry document, but this is good for you to look at to see how our applications scored and rated against one another. So if you're thinking about your project and what might be more competitive, this set of evaluation criteria is something good to review. There's also definitions that are referenced not only in the presentation I just gave, but also in the actual announcement. And so again, in the Code of Federal Regulations, there's a section specific to definitions that may be relevant for you. And then I also listed Marianne's contact at the USDA Rural Development Office. I wanted to mention one extra thing here. Every year, the USDA, when they release the value-added producer grant, they'll identify priority themes or priority areas. This particular announcement has 3 themes that were identified as key priorities for rural development. They're creating more and better markets is one. Advancing racial justice, place-based equity and opportunity is the second. And addressing climate change and environmental justice as the third. These are listed in the full announcement. But these themes, if you're thinking of a project that can overlap any of those themes, that can enhance your competitiveness. So each issuance of the value-added producer grant opportunity will often have different themes associated with it. And so this year, those 3 are listed on the second page of the announcement. You take a look at that. So I would like to thank you for joining this webinar. We're going to open it up for questions and answers next. Shout out again to NOFA New Jersey for sponsoring this. And we'll open it for Q&A, and I will unmute everybody. So you're welcome to either speak your question through the microphone, or I will be monitoring the chat as well to answer any questions. Okay, so you now have the option to unmute yourself if you'd like to speak.
I'm sorry, if I possibly missed this, my connection was going in and out. Does this grant cover facilities for processing?
Unfortunately, it does not. So the value-added producer grant will support the production costs and marketing and sales costs. It cannot support infrastructure, equipment purchases, other capital improvements. So if you're looking at, renovating a space to be able to actually do the processing and production, you would have to be looking at some different opportunities. Depending on your status as a business, there may be some other opportunities within rural development. And so that's a really good point I want to make. If you're an agricultural business, if you're a farm, you're still a business. And so many times we forget that we're also eligible for funding opportunities from Small Business Administration, from USDA Rural Development, focused on more community-oriented development activities, not just production-oriented activities. So if you're curious about infrastructure, USDA Rural Development has a community program for infrastructure build-out on their website that you could take a look at and see if it might suit your needs. Great question.
Thank you.
All right, I had a question come through in the chat. Is rent included in working capital? Is it eligible? That's a little bit tricky. If it's a place that you're occupying for other purposes besides the project, the answer would very likely be no. If it is facility rental time because you're actually using it specifically for that project, for making your salsa, for milling your grains, then it would be more likely to be an allowable expense. It depends on how this is positioned within your project. So with that sort of question fitting in sort of in a gray area, that's where speaking with Marianne Tancredi at USDA Rural Development is a really good idea. Typically, if it's a rent that would be paid so that you can do other things besides just the value-added producer activities, that will be deemed ineligible. But if it's specifically using the processing space for your value-added product creation, then that is more likely to be an eligible expense. Great question in the chat.
I had a question as being a value-added producer myself. I have a commercial kitchen in Pennsylvania, in Gap, PA. Would the service or hourly processing fees or incurred fees that I charge my farmer clients, could they use that in their budgeting as in kind? Okay.
Well, actually, as in kind. Sorry, I started shaking my head too soon. The fees that you charge your clients, if your clients are applying for a value-added producer grant,
yes,
those fees that they might be paying you are definitely a budgetable component. Whether it's a cash or in-kind contribution, there are allowable third-party in-kind contributions. So if you were donating the time to that client, that could be an allowable in-kind contribution. So that I would say that's in scope, but definitely, again, consult with USDA Rural Development to be sure. If the client is going to pay you that money and you will have an exchange of funds, that's completely budgetable. And it could be, listed as that, component that could either be funded by client cash or the USDA would be reimbursing for that.
And the jars materials included as well?
Yeah.
Or amazing. Cool.
So if the packaging, if even the consumables that you might use for cleaning and sanitization of your equipment at that facility, are something that you can itemize and say, this is specifically used for Farmer Jane's salsa production, that can be a billable expense. If it's something like, I just need a barrel of sanitizer and I'm going to use it for all my clients, that's not going to fly with USDA. But if you can say, this particular salsa project, is going to require the purchase of X number of gallons of cleaner and X number of gallons of sanitizer, that's all very much part of the billable expenses. Yeah.
Nice.
Great question.
Thank you.
All right. Other questions?
Hi, I have a question about the eligible applicants and just wanted to double check whether our farm falls under that category. So our land is owned by a company or by a nonprofit organization. So I'm looking at the agricultural producer group, I guess. So if it's a nonprofit organization, but it's just coming from one producer, it would just be from just from the farm that's on the land. Does that count?
That's a good question. So what the USDA is going to be looking at is, what is your status as a business? Whether you own or rent the land is in some ways irrelevant. That if you are an established business within the state and you have your, state registration number, your EIN number, you are, maybe an LLC as the business category, that's going to be, one piece of it, that you are a business. You're not just, some person with a garden and that says, I want to make some salsa, but you're actually an agricultural producer as a business. So if you are renting or leasing land from another entity, that is obviously related to your ability to produce because you need that land, but it is somewhat tangential to your status as an individual producer. There is a category of harvesters, which are very separate from what I think you're suggesting. A harvester would be, if you imagine like in California, where they have, very large farms, maybe with, lettuce production, we'll just, use as an example. And there are roving companies that go from farm to farm that strictly will do harvesting, or you see this with grains a lot, harvest crews out in the Midwest, harvesting wheat or corn, and their sole role in the agricultural value chain is harvesting. They don't plant it, they don't cultivate it, they just harvest it. So there is a harvester category that I did not include in this presentation for brevity, but I don't think that applies to you because it sounds like you're actually cultivating the crops yourself, and you're actually going from seed to something that is close to being edible. Yeah. So I think you would be classified as an individual producer in that state.
Okay, yeah, because the nonprofit itself is not agricultural in nature at all, because we're a therapeutic farm. So it wouldn't necessarily be like an agricultural nonprofit. So we would be individual producers operating under this umbrella, I guess, of them.
That's my perspective.
Okay.
If you don't feel that you clearly fit one of those producer categories, I'll refer you to Marianne. She's probably going to be like, Maria, what did you do? But these are the things that, especially at the onset of writing an application, you want to have understood right away, because if USDA looks at your entity type and how your business is registered or nonprofit is registered, and they say no, you're not actually eligible because of that classification, then straight away that this is not a good fit for you. But if you're a business that is for profit using land that's owned by a nonprofit, then you as a business can apply for value-added producer. If your entire entity is nonprofit, that is a little bit more difficult and likely won't meet eligibility criteria. But again, check with rural development.
Okay, I'll reach out to her. Thank you.
Yep. All right, I had another question in the chat about seed sales, production, and marketing to count as eligible. That's a really great question. I think what you'd have to contemplate is the value added aspect of it, and whether or not you would be fitting in the physical change, that perhaps you're going from bulk seeds to now individual packets of half an ounce of seed per packet. That perhaps could qualify as value added because you're changing how this is being sold and marketed. That a bulk seed sale is going to likely be to a different customer than a small seed packet. If you're thinking about other aspects related to marketing your seeds as originating from a certain place or with certain production practices, that very well could fit under value added as the second bullet related to differentiating features. A lot of times value added activities are focused on consumable food. And so that's where I think, again, getting some clarification from USDA Rural Development may help you if you want to pursue a project like that. All right. Other questions on the microphone? All right, it's quiet on the mics. I have another question in the chat, and this is, we're contemplating nut shelling and sales of the kernels. Does this qualify as value added? It very well may qualify as value added. The question is, are you selling the shelled, the nuts with the shell currently? And are you able to demonstrate that there is an increased value by removing the shell and selling the kernel alone? This, I think, if you can make that link and demonstrate that this shelling process increases the value of your product, increases the reach that you could sell it, it could very well fit within that value added scope. All right. Well, we've used our full hour, so I'd like to thank you all for joining this informational webinar. If you have questions, obviously USDA Rural Development can give you the straight answer. If you're more inclined to just, kind of chit chat, talk around whether or not this might be a good fit, I'm happy to serve as a resource. My email address is, here, hello@growingbrilliance.net. Feel free to drop me a line. I will be sending out a link to the recording as well as the slides shortly, and so look for that in your inbox. But thank you all. Have a great afternoon.